Hello, I'm Regid Ahmed with BBC World News. Our top stories. Drugs giant Pfizer blocks the use of its products in lethal injections, making it more difficult for US states to carry out executions. The president of the International Rescue Committee, David Miliband, tells the BBC it's time for a new deal for refugees around the world. He's calling for all camps to be closed. FIFA appoints its first ever female Secretary General. She's a Senegalese diplomat, Fatma Samoura. And we meet the Smith family, who've struck gold by winning hundreds of millions of dollars in the US Powerball lottery. The pharmaceutical company Pfizer says it is blocking the use of its drugs for lethal injections. The company says its products were meant to save lives, and it strongly objects to their use in carrying out the death penalty. The move reportedly shuts off the last remaining source of execution drugs in the United States. Our correspondent David Willis explains more about Pfizer's latest comments.
Well, in a statement, Pfizer says that it strongly objects to the use of its drugs as part of the lethal injection process, adding that its products are meant to improve or save lives. It's restricting the use of 7 of its drugs that have been used in the past as part of the lethal injection process. That effectively shuts down the official channels for the supply of drugs of this kind. It means that states that want to execute people by lethal injection, it remains the most common form of execution here in the US, will have to effectively go underground to seek out unofficial sources for those drugs. In recent years, it's become an increasingly controversial form of execution. There have been numerous court challenges maintaining that it constitutes as a means of execution cruel and unreasonable punishment. And the fact that there have been botched executions because of the shortage of drugs has not helped the argument either. A couple of years ago, an inmate in Oklahoma, Clayton Lockett, took 43 minutes to die. At one point, he actually rose up off the gurney after there was an untested supply of drugs used to execute him there. So Pfizer's decision to restrict, I should say, the use of its drugs in this form of execution could prove to be highly significant as far as the debate about the death penalty in the United States here is concerned.
It's David Willis there, and you can get more on our website about the death penalty in the United States. That's at bbc.com/news. Now, the UN Security Council has expressed alarm about growing ties between Boko Haram militants and the Islamic State group as Nigeria hosts a summit on how to combat extremism. The summit is being attended by President Hollande of France, as well as the British Foreign Secretary, EU delegations and West African leaders. Nigeria's military says its fight back against Boko Haram since early 2015 has left the Islamists in disarray, but there are mounting concerns over the plight of more than 2.6 million people displaced by the violence. The former British Foreign Secretary and President of the International Rescue Committee, David Miliband, has called for an end to the refugee camp system. Speaking to the BBC's Emily Matlis ahead of a planned humanitarian summit taking place at the end of the month, Mr Miliband also called for the most vulnerable 10% of refugees worldwide to be resettled and integrated into developed countries.
This is the place even those hardened souls of the international relief effort call hell. Dadaab in Kenya started life nearly 25 years ago as a way to offer a temporary home to those fleeing war in Somalia. But today it's grown to a sprawling city of some 35,000. Now the Kenyan government's trying to shut it down, but those inside have led protests against the closure, saying their forced return to Somalia would amount to a mass death sentence. If the problem seems insurmountable, that's because, in its current state, it really is. There are 60 million displaced persons worldwide. 80% of them spend 10 years as a refugee. Now, major voices from the World Bank and the International Rescue Committee have told the BBC, This Week's World, it's time for a new deal.
The plan has got to be about the limited numbers who are going to be relocated to third countries, to richer countries, and the big new effort that's going to take place in the countries that are hosting refugees, which are on the borders of countries at civil wars, which is not countries in Europe and frankly not the US either, who need a new deal that recognises these are long-term problems, that need an economic solution as well as a social solution.
His idea, radical and, let's be honest, controversial, is that refugees the world over be allowed to work in the host country and stay on with residency. Politically, pretty hard to sell. But the UN Humanitarian Summit takes place in Istanbul mid-May. Expect to hear more of this kind of thinking then. Emily Maitlis, BBC News.
Well, there are signs the European Union's efforts to cut the number of migrants arriving are starting to have a big impact. Numbers arriving from Turkey onto the Greek islands are down around 90% in April compared with the previous month. That's according to the EU border agency Frontex. It follows a deal struck between the EU and Turkey. But as our chief correspondent Gavin Hewitt now reports from Izmir, the deal is coming under pressure.
These are the Turkish beaches from where tens of thousands of refugees left for their perilous journey to Europe. Today, all that remains are discarded clothes. Almost no refugees are making the crossing to Greece. But the deal between Turkey and the EU to solve the migrant crisis is in danger of collapsing. Go into the fields near the Turkish coast close to Greece and you find Syrian refugees like Murat, who once dreamt of going to Europe but has given up. The Turkish-EU deal, signed in March, has all but blocked the migrant trail.
The sea border with Greece is now closed. If someone wants to go to Europe, they cannot. I did want to go, but now I can't.
The Turkish Coast Guard patrols are much more rigorous. Just 2 months ago, 8,000 refugees crossed here in 1 month. So far in May, the numbers are around 300. And for those who make it to Greece, the route north through the Balkans is lined with fences and riot police.
There is no possibility to move further from Greece. And in Greece, the movement from the islands to the mainland became impossible now.
So in Turkey, the tables where the smugglers did their deals are almost empty, and the shops can't sell their life jackets. The Turkish government says it has honoured its part of the deal.
If the refugees go outside the cities where they are registered, they are told to go back. If they try to reach the coast and escape, the police will catch them.
The easing of the refugee crisis depends on a controversial deal between Turkey and the EU. Turkey clamping down on the migrants in exchange for visa-free travel to much of Europe. But the European Parliament is insisting that first Turkey must carry out further reforms. Turkey says it has done enough and the whole deal is looking fragile. So there is a risk of the migrant crisis returning. The developments are being followed closely in Germany, where most of the previous refugees went, and by the referendum campaigns in Britain. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Izmir.
FIFA has appointed a woman as its Secretary-General for the first time in its history. She's Fatma Samoura from Senegal, a career diplomat who works for the United Nations. If she passes an eligibility check, she'll start her new job at World Football's governing body next month. Vishala Sripathma has more.
Not somebody from the past, but somebody new, is how FIFA President Gianni Infantino described his new Secretary-General. Fatma Samoura will be the first female to hold the position.
I propose to the Council, who accepted, to nominate as Secretary-General Mrs. Fatma Samoura. She is Senegalese. She is 54 years old. She's working since 21 years in the United Nations. She's a great person. She's used to manage big organizations, and she will bring a fresh wind to FIFA.
She starts her new job in June, replacing Jerome Valk, who was banned from football-related activity for 12 years. Valk's departure followed the resignation of FIFA's former president, Sepp Blatter, who was also banned from the game for 6 years for breaching ethics guidelines. While Samura's career has not been firmly entrenched in the world of football, in her statement she pointed out that a 20-year career at the United Nations makes her a good fit.
Today is a wonderful day for me, and I am honoured to take on the role of FIFA's Secretary General. I believe this role is a perfect fit for my skills and experience, which I will use to help grow the game of football all over the world.
With sponsors, campaigners and fans demanding more independence in the running of the sport, the arrival of a figure from outside football politics will please some critics. New reforms limiting the powers of FIFA's president means Samura arguably becomes the most important figure in the world of football. Vishala Sripathma, BBC News.
Brazil's suspended President Dilma Rousseff has told journalists her government had faced a systematic boycott to create the environment to remove her. Ms. Rousseff has been temporarily removed from her job whilst she faces impeachment. She says the interim government, led by her former Vice President, Michel Temer, is illegitimate. Julia Canera reports from Brasilia.
This is the Alvorada Palace, the presidential residence here in Brasilia, where President Dilma Rousseff lives and will stay, even during the period she's suspended from her role. And we've come to see what she'll say, how she will react. As she's been saying, she's going to meet the international press. Let's see what she has to say. We're now inside the palace, and this is the room where she will talk to the international press just one day after having been suspended officially from presidency to face impeachment trial.
A mim, tentaram sistematicamente me investigar.
They tried to investigate me systematically and turn my life inside out looking for something. But I have no foreign bank accounts and no record of inappropriate use of public money. My government has been systematically boycotted to create instability and a perfect environment for a coup. That's why I say the impeachment is a process that masks an attempt to reach the presidency indirectly, because they would not have managed to get there by popular vote.
Eu lamento que, depois de muito tempo,
she also criticizes the fact that the new cabinet, announced by the interim president Michel Temer, has no women and no black people. This does not represent Brazilian society, she says. The president said that she will use the coming months to raise the debate in society about the circumstances of the impeachment proceedings she is facing. She intends to travel to other countries as well. But she has up to 6
Julia
months
Canera with that report from Brasilia. Well, stay with us on BBC News. Still to come, Donald Trump denies that he posed as his own spokesman in the 1990s. We'll listen to a taped conversation which appears to prove him wrong.
She's one of the world's biggest film stars, but as a UN refugee envoy, Angelina Jolie Pitt has a perspective on global migration, the rights and responsibilities of refugees, and those of the countries they flee to. For World on the Move, she'll speak to me, Michelle Hussein, on Monday on BBC World News.
The Ganges is one of the greatest rivers on Earth, but it is also one of the dirtiest. Sewage and pollution has turned its sacred waters into a toxic and deadly cocktail. Can the Ganges be saved? Find out with me, Justin Rowlatt, here on BBC World News.
Hello everybody, Dan Walker here to let you know what's going on this week's Football Focus. We shall be looking ahead to the final weekend in the English Premier League. And we'll also have a special on Chinese football for you with Sven-Göran Eriksson. That's all to come on Football Focus this weekend only on BBC World News.
This is BBC World News. I'm Regid Ahmed. The latest headlines. The US pharmaceuticals company Pfizer has announced controls to stop its products being used in lethal injections. The president of the International Rescue Committee, David Miliband, has called for all refugee camps to be closed, with refugees being integrated into mainstream society instead. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been to see firsthand the devastation caused by wildfires in Alberta. One of the worst hit areas was the town of Fort McMurray, where nearly 90,000 people were forced to evacuate. The BBC's Regina Vajanathan has been there and sent this report.
The fires have left Fort McMurray, but the aftermath is brutal. For the country's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the test is how he handles one of Canada's worst natural disasters. As he toured some of the devastated areas, he praised the work of firefighters and rescue workers.
The work you did to save so much of this community, to save so much of this city and the downtown core and so many homes was unbelievable.
The flames were so fierce, few could imagine the damage they'd leave in their wake. More than a week on, and the smoke was still rising as we drove into Fort McMurray. It's still closed off, but we were given access to see the extent of the damage firsthand. A few weeks ago, this was a thriving centre for the region's oil industry. Now look what's left.
If you want to get an idea of how powerful the wildfires were here in Fort McMurray, just take a look at this. This is what's left of what was once a family home. It's just cinder and ash. It was completely razed to the ground, and the smell of smoke still hangs heavy in the air here.
Locals say it's a miracle no one lost their lives. 85% of the cities remained intact, but with thousands of homes destroyed, this natural disaster has created a very human one. 90,000 people still have no idea when they'll be allowed to return home, or if they even have one to go to. Just down the road, the small town of Lac La Biche has trebled in size. But as people take shelter here, frustration's setting in. Evacuees have been given a one-off debit card payment of $1,250. But for Adam and Tracy, that won't go far.
We can't pay rent anywhere. So if this goes for, let's say, 120 days or more than that, I don't know what people are going to do. You know, we're refugees, not evacuees, and we're tax-paying refugees on top of it.
But like many here, Adam thinks his Prime Minister should have visited sooner.
He doesn't care about Fort McMurray, otherwise he would have been here. And there's no excuse for that. We're low on the totem pole of he doesn't even know we exist.
But high up in the air, Mr. Trudeau is trying to show he does care. For him, the task ahead is vast. This landscape's changed beyond recognition, but there are still fires to put out before homes and lives can be rebuilt. Regina Vaidyanathan, BBC News, Fort McMurray.
Donald Trump has denied rumours that he posed as his own publicist for decades. The Washington Times has obtained a phone conversation from 1991 between a journalist and a PR man calling himself John Miller, who sounded just like Mr. Trump. Several other reporters said they regularly talked to a Trump spokesman who sounded exactly like the man expected to be the Republican nominee for president. The US network NBC broadcast the recording.
What's your name again? John Miller. And you work with Governor? Yes, that's correct. He treats everybody well. And, you don't know him, but he's a... No, I have met him. Have you met him? Yes. He's a good guy, and he's not going to hurt anybody. He gets called by everybody in the book in terms of women. And, like who? Well, he gets called by a lot of people. I've never seen anybody get so many calls from the press. Where did you come from? I basically work for different firms. I work for a couple of different firms. And I'm somebody that knows. And I think somebody that he trusts and likes.
In an interview with NBC, Mr. Trump said he had many imposters.
No, I don't think it. I don't know anything about it. You're telling me about it for the first time, and it doesn't sound like my voice.
Sport now, and one of the world's best rugby players, Dan Carter, will look to add the European Champions Cup trophy to his silverware haul when his Racing 92 side take on Saracens in a highly anticipated final today. Carter, the World Player of the Year who helped New Zealand win the World Cup in October, has helped pull together a formidable and cosmopolitan outfit in Paris, as Patrick Geary reports. Well, it's surely every American's dream to scoop the Powerball, one of the world's biggest lottery prizes. For many, it's a chance to buy expensive houses, cars or holidays. But a mother and her 7 children who've claimed a $429 million jackpot decided that rather than going on a spending spree, they'll put the money to worthwhile causes in their local community. The BBC's Russell Trott reports.
At 70 years old, Pearlie Mae Smith is taking it all in her stride. She summed up what it meant to buy the winning Powerball lottery ticket at a local New Jersey convenience store with one simple word.
Wow. She didn't actually tell me. She told my sister, Marcia. And Marcia called me on the phone and said, guess who won the Powerball? And I said, who? And she said, we did.
The jackpot is the 6th biggest in Powerball history. And Pearlie's 7 grown-up children say they want to spend the money wisely. For instance, on social issues such as helping at-risk young girls to get internships.
It was like an affirmation from God because we each have dreams that we want to fulfill in this life and do for our community and do for each other and our families. And it was like, well, we have been funded to do that. And that's what we're going to do, work in our communities and work in our family.
Multi-million-dollar wins are nothing new with the Powerball, and despite odds of more than 290 million to 1, Americans are still prepared to form a long queue in the hope of buying that winning ticket and making their dreams come true. Pearlie and her family have decided to take a $284 million lump sum, and whilst the win is still sinking in, they say they'll share their good fortune around for good causes. Russell Trott, BBC News.
Imagine zooming from Los Angeles to San Francisco in a tube at supersonic speed in just 30 minutes instead of a 6-hour drive. Well, the Hyperloop project, conceived by Elon Musk, is aiming to do just that by replacing short-haul air travel by whooshing people using magnets and pockets of air. Our North America technology reporter Dave Lee has been in Boston checking out the first version of a pod.
The race to create Hyperloop has begun. This test near Las Vegas this week showed how such a pod could get up to speed, though next on this particular team's agenda is to work out how to slow it down again. Several companies and research teams are working on realising this vision of a new type of human transportation. One of them is at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The team here has made a scaled-down version of a pod that may someday carry people along at super high speed.
So back here we have the propulsion interface. This is where a launch vehicle will push on the pod and accelerate it up to 250 miles an hour.
It uses magnets to lift the pod into the air, reducing friction.
Our pod is probably about a third to a half scale of a real size system, so we can't really fit a full size human. But in a real system, the idea would be to carry multiple people inside.
Imagine you're at the front, sat just here. You're in a pod that's levitating. You're traveling at hundreds of miles an hour in an airtight tube propelled by magnets. Would you get in?
The ride is extremely comfortable because you're levitating, so you have very little vibration. I think the goal for Hyperloop is to try and keep the acceleration and deceleration within the same kind of regime that you have on an aircraft.
Plaudits of Hyperloop say these pods could be in public use as early as 2020, but doubters say it will never happen, not because of technology, but because it will simply be too expensive to build. The MIT team is now preparing to test out their pod on a real stretch of tubing. They hope to do that in August. Dave Lee, BBC News, Boston.
Well, that's it for now. You can get in touch with me and the team on Twitter. I'm at Regid Ahmed. You can also keep in touch with all of the world news on @BBC World and @BBC Breaking. See you soon.